Hi, this is Len Edgerly. Welcome to the Kindle Chronicles podcast. Today is July 9th, 2021. I'm recording this at our home in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I will be heading up to Ocean Park, hopefully in just a little bit, because the traffic on Friday is going to be pretty intense. I'll be listening to a book that I'm listening to on tape, Jeff Tweedy's How to Write One Song. It's just a wonderful description of the songwriting process by the frontman for Wilco, which is a band I wasn't that familiar with before I started following Jeff Tweedy. He did a great interview with the Ezra Klein show, I think probably last week. So this episode is going to be mainly my conversation with Jessica Chiarella, who is the author of The Lost Girls, and I'll tell you about that when I introduce her formally. And a little more background on why I'm down here. It was pretty much because of Tropical Storm Elsa, which looked like it was going to dump a lot of rain on the Boston area, and we have trouble with flooding in our basement here. And in fact, when I got down a couple of days ago to pick up my sleep test, there was water in the bathroom, and there had been some kind of an overflow from the drain in the shower, and this prompted all kinds of analysis of what is going on. And then as this storm approached, I figured, well, I better just stay here and make sure that there isn't flooding in the basement in Darlene's quilting room. The good news is the basement is dry. I heard the sump pump kick in at some point. It was capturing water that had somehow made its way into the basement and depositing it in the storm drain, so that's working. There's some kind of another problem, too complicated to share here, about why water is getting past a check valve and then coming up through the shower drain. But we've got something that's a jury rig to protect against that as well. So I'll be heading back to Ocean Park, hoping that the basement will stay dry while we're gone. Let's do the interview. Jessica Chiarella holds a master's degree in writing and publishing from DePaul University and an MFA in creative writing from the University of California, Riverside. She lives in Chicago. Her debut novel, which was titled And Again, was published in 2016 by Touchstone. That's an imprint of Simon & Schuster. It is rated 4 stars based on 83 reviews at Amazon, and it received some really impressive reviews for a first novel. Kirkus said, Chiarella's engaging writing creates so many haunting moments that readers will find themselves moving quickly through the story as well as awaiting her next work. This is a novel about what it means to be human, with all the flaws and vulnerabilities that implies, and whether we can ever truly begin again. Book List called that first novel contemplative, adding Chiarella's entrancing prose and fully fleshed characters should garner widespread enthusiastic praise. I didn't have time to read Jessica's first novel and getting ready to talk to her, but I really did enjoy The Lost Girls. That's her second book, and that was released this week by G.P. Putnam's Sons, an imprint of Penguin Random House. It's a twisty psychological thriller starring 2 podcasters, so how could I turn down the opportunity to talk to her? I connected with Jessica by Zoom in Chicago from Ocean Park on Wednesday, July 7th. I wanted to give you a chance to savor the quality of her writing, so I began by asking her to read the opening 2 paragraphs from The Lost Girls.
The world is full of lost girls, scores of them, girls who disappear into the night, who inject heroin and fall off the map, who love other girls and come home to find their parents have changed the locks. Girls who run away, girls who are taken, girls full of sin, ones who like boys more than they love Jesus. Girls who are locked in basements and held until they give birth to more girls. The weight of them could drag a fleet of ships to the ocean floor. I know all about them. I've made it my business to know. The recording plays over the sound system of the crowded theater in Midtown Manhattan. The house lights are momentarily down, and on stage a logo of a retro radio mic, lit up in purple neon light, hangs above the proceedings, the crucifix in this particular church.
First of all, as a podcaster, I love the idea of a microphone being compared with a crucifix. I think that's an appropriately important symbol. But who's telling the story? Who are we listening to as the story opens?
It's a character named Marty Reese. She's my protagonist in this book, and she's actually both the voice in the recording and the person narrating. So she's listening to herself, this clip from her podcast being played during an awards ceremony, and that sort of kicks off the book. So we get kind of her backstory in the podcast as well as sort of the narration in the beginning.
And then, without getting far enough for any spoilers, what is the drama, the crime that she ends up being involved in with her podcasting friend Andrea?
Yeah, so Marty has this very interesting backstory where she was interesting and terrible. Her older sister Maggie was kidnapped or disappeared when she was 8 years old. They were walking home together, and they were stopped in the woods by a car, and Maggie told Marty to run. She basically let go of her hand and said, go. And Marty watched her get into this car with a van that she didn't recognize, and Maggie was never seen again. And that is, sort of the content of the podcast that, we're getting the clip of in the beginning, is Marty telling the story of her sister's disappearance. And the podcast goes viral. It becomes very popular, and she wins this, big award in the opening scene. And so as a result, she's contacted by a lot of people who have information about her sister's case. And one of them is this woman named Ava Vreeland, who reaches out about her own case because she thinks that there might be linkage between these two. And she's working to free her younger brother from prison because she believes that he's been falsely accused of a crime that is actually linked to Maggie's disappearance, to Marty's sister's disappearance. So, it's these sort of two cases that are working in parallel, this backstory about this kidnapping from Marty's family, and then this sort of current timeline of this wrongful conviction case that they're trying to get solved.
The podcasting part really rang true to me, and I'm curious, before you started writing this story, what did you know about podcasting? There's a great character in there when she says, well, what's a podcast? Is that like a TED Talk? Or what did you know about podcasting when you started? And then what kind of research did you do to get up to speed to have it be a credible part of the story?
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, because that was, something that I tried to really get right. I'd listened to a lot of podcasts, starting with Serial, sort of, the ultimate true crime podcast, and, a lot of other true crime. I became a huge fan of these true crime podcasts. And so I enjoyed the sort of long form story and the way that, they were able to get kind of a deep dive into these cases and give a lot of context that sort of didn't exist in, the 15-second news clips that you would get on the evening news that would cover these crimes, originally. And so I felt like this was the kind of the perfect medium. And I really did, try to do a lot of research to get it right. I've got friends who are actually involved in podcasts. I've got a friend out in LA who runs a podcast production company. So I got a lot of information from her. And then I have a couple of friends who are, more kind of amateurish podcasters who just sort of like record together in their kitchen and have this podcast. And so I was able to capture the experience of two people on kind of different ends of the podcasting spectrum, and try to put Marty and Andrea somewhere in the middle, and say, okay, these are people who they're still just recording in their back bedroom, but they've got the good equipment that, they know what they're doing. It's not like they're just, fiddling around with it. So that was a lot of fun to sort of research and sort of take a dive into.
The other thing that I noticed, because it's something I'm always thinking about, is Andrea seems quite skilled in interviewing. She has her timing and pauses. What are some of the elements that you learned about that to have a portrait of somebody who not only knows how to do a podcast and the basics and all, but to actually draw people out in a way that's good to listen to?
That was really interesting, because I remember having a conversation with a friend of mine who, was pitching me this podcast, and he was like, I don't know what they're doing that's so different from anyone else. It was like this pair of comedians who, it was just a very conversational podcast, and said, for some reason, they're able to get stories out of their guests that you don't really hear a lot. Like something about what they're doing is, sort of special. And so I remember listening to this podcast and trying to figure out, okay, what is it? Why are they so good? Why is their, because their podcast was sort of just successful based off the conversations that they would, have with people. And I realized it did have a lot to do with stepping back, with sort of, setting up a question, allowing someone, the opportunity to scratch the surface, and then stepping back and letting them, go with a deep dive. And that was kind of a very interesting, way to try to frame Andrea's interview style, where she can lead someone towards a bit of information that she thinks is important, but really she's going to let them, take it where they, allow them enough leeway to take the answer where they want to go. And so that felt, important to try to capture.
Interesting. So you noticed that happening in that podcast that you studied. Huh. Well, if you want to just keep talking and go further, that would be fine.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's kind of what it was like, where, these hosts would be like, that's so interesting. Mm-hmm. And then just, let them kind of keep talking. And it sort of took interviews to places where you wouldn't expect. And you could tell that there was no game plan on their part. They're like, we're going to have this conversation, just sort of let it go where it needs to go. And it made for some really very poignant and sort of emotionally complex conversations as a result.
Yeah, and it's kind of scary because I think, especially when you start out podcasting, I mean, I've got questions here. I've done a lot of research. You have to just sort of forget it and then jump in, and you're not really sure what that looks like, Mm-hmm. Maybe that's like writing a thriller for the first time. You just sit down and start doing it. Yeah,
I mean, that was, talk about, taking on something where that you don't know how it's going to turn out. I mean, I think that was the interesting thing about writing this book, is that I felt like it was important to sort of plot out an outline before I started and know, okay, in terms of the, procedure of the case, in terms of the forensic evidence that's necessary, there were details that I had to sort of seed in at different places. So I knew that there was a structure that I needed to adhere to in terms of the way that events would unfold. And because I had done that prep work beforehand, I mean, it's kind of similar where you said, I've got this research, I've got these questions, and then I have to sort of just see where it goes. Because once I started writing Marty, it was just about, this character just sort of came to me, and, with all of her damage and with all of her, trauma and all of her sort of self-destructive tendencies, I had to sort of just allow her to, tear her way through this plot structure that I had, devised, and sort of see what she would do, as these events unfold, and see how she would react emotionally. So it felt in some, in probably some strange way, very similar to, an interview just sort of going where it needs to go.
Yeah. And it's a mix because you did have the structure, and maybe because you've got that structure, you're freer to follow the dangerous, surprising turns that a conversation takes or a plot takes, driven by your character.
Yeah, I think that's true. And, again, that's probably also similar, which is if you've done the prep work up front, you can sort of, feel secure to let it dive into trickier, more complex territory. And that's really how it felt with Marty, where, she could behave in any number of ways as these events are unfolding. But because I knew, okay, this is the next event that needs to happen, I always had a target to aim for as I was writing. So it was an interesting and very fun writing experience for that reason.
Huh. I heard a conversation you had, I think, with a teacher of yours from DePaul, where you said that when you were writing this, you were in your own kind of difficult period, with your writing and the job and stuff like that. And so to write a character who was also in a difficult period, but for a really difficult stuff that she was up against, and she's making bad decisions that, hopefully you weren't making when you had your trial. But that fascinated me because it sounded like it was maybe kind of liberating for you to write that kind of a character in the midst of your own challenging period? I mean, did Marty sort of get you through a rough spot in addition to getting a book out of it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was, one of the fringe benefits, I guess, of working on this was, I mean, I was in a tricky spot. I was sort of, I had done a master's program, an MFA program, and I had sort of gotten back to my hometown and got a day job and was planning on just, writing a novel just based on, everything that I had learned. And I felt, I published a book before. And so I felt like, oh, I know how to do this. This will be fine. And I struggled and struggled and struggled. I was sort of trying to balance, having a full-time job and being a professional person. And then also, having the second job of being a writer. And, I got to a point where it was just like banging my head against a wall and feeling like I'm trying to do both of these things. And, I'm sort of shortchanging both of them in some way. And, I feel like when I started The Lost Girls, I knew that I wanted to just sort of tear into this project. I took a couple of weeks off of work at one point and just wrote crazy amounts so that I could sort of devote my full focus to this. And, the character of Marty, I feel like in a very different, definitely, and very much more intense way had reached this point in her life. She sort of, took advantage of the advantages that she was given. She got married, she went to college, she did all of these things that sort of set her up for success, and then reached a point in her life where she realized she could not pretend to be normal anymore. Like she couldn't pretend, she couldn't keep up the facade anymore. And she just absolutely tears down her life. And for me, that was just writing a book. For her, it's, making a lot of bad decisions and, hurting people along the way. And I feel like writing the character, was a way of sort of me processing this feeling of like, I can't keep, pretending that writing is not important. I can't keep pretending like this is not the thing that I want to put all of my focus into. And it felt in a little bit like I could sort of get all of that out vicariously through Maggie's, sort of emotional break. And it was very cathartic. Yeah, it absolutely helps, teach me the importance of writing in my life and the way that I need to prioritize it. So it was really beneficial.
Yeah, you sort of had a chance to measure your own sense of frustration by how extreme Marty's choices were, that you could kind of look at that and say, I better make some changes in my life. Otherwise I might.
Or, at least I'm not that bad.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. A little serenity creeps in.
Yeah.
You had the MFA program and Master's in English, so you had a lot of training in writing. But to write a thriller, you tried to analyze, well, what makes a good thriller? And to me, that's kind of a fascinating moment, because somebody that had your education and your interests and your desire to write a whole new book, how did you answer that question of what makes a good thriller? And what are the points that you pulled out? And did you tweak the model? Did you say, okay, thrillers usually do this and the successful ones do this, but I'm going to do something a little bit different? I mean, what was that kind of genesis like?
Yeah, that was really interesting because, I read a lot of thrillers, and I read a lot of, sort of the big thrillers, and I tried to understand the ways in which, I've studied screenplay structure a little bit. And so that's kind of the model that I use is like the easiest way to analyze story is like, does it adhere to screenplay structure, or is there something fundamentally different about this? It's sort of just like the default way that my brain likes to look at things. And, some of them did and some of them didn't. And so, I realized that wasn't going to be the trick. It's like, making or breaking that particular structure wasn't necessarily the thing that made or broke a thriller. And so for me, it was really looking at the ones that seemed to be doing very well and really capturing people's attention were the ones that took a deep interest in character and the psychology of their characters. I think for me, the sort of platonic ideal of a thriller is always going to be Gone Girl. I think that book works so well on so many levels, from a story perspective, from like a plot and how that story unfolds, perspective, as well as from, a character psychology perspective. You get deep into these people's minds and often uncover very twisted things while you're there. And that was the sort of aim, I guess, that I had. But, the other part was, because I was also doing all of this true crime research, I also had to think about, okay, what makes for a good true crime documentary? And sort of use that structure as well when I was thinking, what made Serial so great? What made the Jinx so fascinating? Is there going to be a turn where something is revealed just by accident that wasn't before? Or is this going to be all about police procedure? And so I had to sort of, bring in a lot of the facets of these true crime documentaries and these podcasts and sort of weave it in with sort of the classic thriller novel structure as well.
There's some tension in the story, which was interesting, between the police and the podcasters that were doing the true crime podcast. And I could certainly understand how the police might think, well, who are these two women that are, messing around in our real crime? And Serial I think it actually had an impact on that particular case. Must have been a similar thing with the police. But did you end up thinking that true crime podcasting is an important new way that crimes can be dealt with, or are there dangers? Have you seen times when it's just completely messed up and had unintended consequences that were very negative, or how does that look to you?
Yeah, that is, I think, the big question that's sort of at the heart of this book, because, I do think there is a really important place for true crime within, how we look at crime and violence in our society. I think people are kind of desperate for story and like deep context and, in these cases, because for so long, especially in the pre-internet days, we were just given write-ups in newspapers and 15-second spots on the evening news to sort of give us this glimpse of like all of these, this violence that was happening. It was the face on the milk carton every morning at breakfast. And, for me, I think a lot of people find, kind of an odd comfort in true crime, because it really takes a deep dive that we were all very unaccustomed to up until very recently in terms of these cases. It really has a lot of empathy for its victims. It has, it gives voice to a lot of the people who were impacted by these crimes. And I think, a lot of people were very desperate for a feeling like, okay, all of this indiscriminate violence, does fit into a context. These are real people. This isn't indiscriminate. This isn't just chaos. This, all of these people have lives, and all of these crimes have stories behind them. And so that for me was kind of the way that I thought that Marty would think about what she's doing, that she's giving her sister a story, that she's making her real for other people. But then the other side of that, which is the dangerous side, is you have a lot of people with no background in journalism, in criminal justice, in investigation, in law, who are really diving into these cases. And there are times in which the gray areas are very gray, and you have a lot of people who feel very strongly on different sides about what the truth of these cases are. And I think there is a part of me that feels like that's good. Like, the more conversation that we have about the nuance of the criminal justice system and the ways in which it's ill-equipped to actually find truth, and is better at sort of closing the loop on a story rather than continuing to investigate and continuing to consider. I think that's an important conversation to have, but I also feel like there have been times in which cases have, the real life consequences are there, and cases have been impacted, and it's like, wow, you don't want to get this wrong. So it feels like a tremendous responsibility on anyone who wants to take on a true crime case, that, to try to get it as right and to be as ethical as possible.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. I mean, I do interviews with people that are just sort of fun, but I don't have anybody's incarceration hanging in the balance. I mean, the stakes are pretty high on that kind of a show.
Yeah. And, I think that was sort of the thing that I had to keep in mind, was the ones that have done, that have been super popular are some of the ones that have had an impact. I mean, there are a lot of examples now. The Jinx is the one that comes top of mind with Robert Durst, where, his case was completely reopened after that documentary that, he himself had sort of brought to fruition by getting in contact with this director. So it was kind of crazy, but, you do see these real world consequences from these documentaries, and it just feels like a lot of power to wield for a lot of people who, don't have any real practical background in journalism or investigation, so don't have that sort of, those ethical boundaries that a lot of other people might have.
I've had a chance to talk to Dean Koontz a few times, who is 75 years old. He's been writing. I was trying to figure out how old he was when he published his first novel, but I would guess it'd be similar to your age. He's been at it a long time. And if you picture yourself at 75 and you've been able, you've chosen the path that is going to avoid you being self-destructive to yourself. You've found it. What do you hope to see, or what would you hope to see in you as a writer at his age, in terms of what you're writing, how you're writing, what your life as a writer might look like?
Oh, that's really interesting. I think, I would hope that I would evolve in terms of my understanding of people. Really, I feel like the characters that I've written so far are characters that I feel like I understand just based on my own experience and the experiences of, a lot of people in my life. I feel like at 75, if I, continue writing at a pretty good clip between now and then, I hope that would expand more and more to take on, more diverse characters, more perspectives, and, continue to deepen my empathy and my ability to sort of be curious about the world around me. I think that the worst case scenario would be to be at 75 and feel like, what do I write next? I feel like I always want to continuously indulge my curiosity and continuously, become more and more interested in the world as I write. And so far that has worked very well, sort of following my curiosities and following my interests has been the thing that has sort of driven what, the content of my work. And I would hope at 75 to just be even more curious and to be even more interested. I would hate to get to the point where it just feels like I'm writing for the sake of writing, or I'm writing because it's a job. And I feel like the people who have the longest careers are the ones who do have that intense curiosity and do, sort of move from deep dive to deep dive into topics that are just sort of fascinating to them, because that comes through in the work. If someone is really into the thing that they're writing about, I think The Martian is such a good example of that, where, who would have thought that people would just sit down and, read all of this stuff about botany, from an astronaut's perspective.
Right,
and it works so well because the author is so into it, and the character has such an interest and can speak to it in such an interesting way. And I think that's the best, that's writing at its best, where you can, get all of this exposure to a topic that you normally would not in your day-to-day life, and feel like, oh, this is really cool. I think that's the best. And that's what I hope to continue doing.
If the writer's having fun, the reader's having fun.
100% of the time. Yeah.
Yeah. I know you've got to go. Tell us about your next project. It's also a thriller, and when can we read it, and what's it going to be about?
So, I've got actually 2 projects going simultaneously, which is kind of, the standard state of things for me. But I'm working on a new thriller. I just started it. It's set in the 1970s. It's about this graduate student who goes to Europe on a work trip. She's a teaching assistant. And so it's set in 1970s Rome. And then she meets this kind of mysterious guy who may or may not have good intentions, can't quite tell, and sort of goes off with him to Greece, and then, ends up in sort of 1970s San Francisco. And it's all about sort of the political situation, in Europe and the United States in the 1970s. And it's got a bit of a love story and is also like a very twisty, psychological thriller as well. So I'm sort of really gearing up to work on that. And I'm very excited about it. And then I'm also, continuing to work on the book that I started as, a thesis in one of my graduate programs in my MFA program. That's a huge book. It's historical. It's multi-generational, and it's about this family of Chicago women who can see imminent death by touching people. So it's a little more in the magical realism, sci-fi realm, and it's historical. So it's taken a great deal of research, and it's like 400 pages. So it's a big project that I'm continuously trying to wrap my arms around. But both of those are sort of ongoing. No definite timelines yet, but hopefully sooner rather than later.
Terrific. I have been speaking with Jessica Chiarella, author of The Lost Girls, published this week by G.P. Putnam's Sons. Thanks very much, Jessica. Good luck with the book.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This has been wonderful.
Well, that was a fun conversation. As I was editing it this morning, I particularly enjoyed hearing Jessica answer my question about what kind of writer she hopes to be when she's the age of Dean Koontz. She said she hopes to deepen her empathy and curiosity between now and then. I think that's an admirable goal for anyone moving through the decades of a life. And I completely agree with her observation when she said the people who have the longest careers are the ones who do have that intense curiosity and do move from deep dive to deep dive into topics that are fascinating to them, because that comes through in the work. My guess is that Jessica may not be likely to find herself writing a long-running series in her writing career, although you never know. And I think that's because of the variety of her first topics so far. And again, the debut novel is speculative fiction telling the story of 4 seriously ill characters who receive genetically perfect bodies and representing lifetime second chances for each of them. The Lost Girls, as you've heard, is a psychological thriller, and her next thriller sounds kind of similar, but it has completely different characters. And then there is that 400-page novel coming from her MFA thesis drawing on magical realism. So it's exciting to get to know an author early in her career and to imagine all the topics that she will dive deeply into. I don't know exactly how old Jessica is. I think it's safe to say that I will need to keep podcasting till I'm about 110 in order to visit with her when she's 75. If so, I'd love to check in with her and get a feeling for her levels of empathy and curiosity after all the books that I hope she'll write. I also appreciated her explanation of why true crime podcasts play a valuable role in giving people a voice who are affected by crime. To me, it makes sense that people are desperate for stories and deep context as a way to go beyond the coverage of crime in traditional media outlets. I want to thank Heather Mill, my helpful source for great author interviews from Penguin Random House. She set up this week's conversation with Jessica. I'm not able to accept every invitation Heather or other people email to me, but I've never been disappointed when I've had one of her authors on the show. So, Heather, please keep those invites coming. That's it for this week. I've got a chance to get on the road and beat some of the traffic, perhaps up to Maine. My guest next week will be from Ocean Park. When we were in Sanibel over the winter, I had fun doing interviews with some of the local voices down there, the chief of police of Sanibel and a few others. And so I thought this year in Ocean Park, and I'm going to reach out to some people in the community so I can share give you some sense of what Ocean Park is like. It's in some ways similar to Sanibel in odd ways, but obviously very different, not just because how much colder the ocean is. But next week's guest is going to be Rob Drake. He is the incoming president of the Ocean Park Association. The OPA does a real good job maintaining the quiet, family-oriented ambiance of the village of Ocean Park, which is part of Old Orchard Beach. And Ocean Park began as a Chautauqua community in 1881. Rob, as I understand it, is from Ohio. I was told by a local he married into Ocean Park, so his wife's family, I think, has been here for generations, similar to mine. I look forward to talking with the usual Clubhouse crew. We gather Mondays at 1 p.m. after the podcast, so the next one will be Monday, July 19th at 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. If you'd like to join us, you'll find a link in the show notes at thekindlechronicles.com. And if you have any ideas for questions, anything you'd like to communicate with, just feel free to send me an email at podchronicles@gmail.com. And I do have some invites to Clubhouse if you'd like to join Clubhouse so that you could join us for that Monday conversation. Thanks for listening. Elsa has left the house. The sun is actually peeking out, so that was a fast-moving tropical storm that went through here, and like I said earlier, the basement is dry, so I think I can hit the road. I hope you have a good week. Bye.